Hello and welcome to week 3 in our behavior management class where we're taking on chapter 3, operant conditioning. This is pretty much the introduction to the material that we will be covering for the rest of the class, focusing on operant conditioning, classical conditioning, really giving us a foundation in terms of stimulus and response and how learning can happen with that. And that's certainly a part of operant conditioning. But we're introduced in this chapter to the history of behaviorism as a field, a subfield within psychology, starting with Thorndike, moving on to John Watson, and finally with B.F. Skinner. So Thorndike introduced what I think is one of the very few laws. I think I've come across a couple others in readings over the years, but this is the one that stands at, the field of physics and chemistry and all of that. They have laws in which matter behaves in particular ways. The other things they call theories. So there's the laws of thermodynamics. There's the theory of gravity. Those kinds of things. And laws are sort of the gold standard in the world of science. If we can understand the laws of the universe, the laws of nature, then we can understand how nature works, the rules by which it follows. And along comes Thorndike and introduces courageously the notion of a law within psychology. And I like the way in which he phrases this because it shows some interesting language of the day. Thorndike's law of effect, quote, if an association is followed by a, quote, satisfying state of affairs, it will be strengthened. And if it is followed by an annoying state of affairs, it will be weakened. Now this kind of fundamentally, we behave in a certain way, and that results in a relatively satisfying state of being. We recognize that as good and we're more likely to repeat that behavior. Conversely, we behave in such a way and it results in an annoying or unsatisfying, I love the word annoying, an unsatisfactory state of affairs. It leads to us not doing that behavior. Okay? Now, because this is a law, we have to look at and we'll be doing this later in the class, as to when we start looking at the functional aspects of behavior, you'll sometimes come across behavior that on the surface results in what we would definitively see as a punishment, but yet the behavior persists. Now, this would seem to be a violation of this law. It's an unsatisfactory state of being following the behavior. Why is the behavior still there? We are going to talk about in this class when we see circumstances like that, we rely upon the law, just like we rely on our GPS, right? We rely on the law to say something is reinforcing this. There is a satisfying state of affairs. That doesn't mean that they're mutually exclusive. We can act in ways in which it produces both a satisfying and annoying, unsatisfactory state of affairs. Yet, if the satisfying part is more powerful than the annoying part, we may still do it. Exercise, let's say, works that way. We may exercise, there's pain, there's achiness, but the camaraderie and the achieving of goals and the progression toward being in shape overrides that. So we see this situation. When we are unaware of some of the positive or negative consequences of behavior, we have to turn to the law and say, if the behavior is being maintained or it's increasing, something is creating a satisfactory state of affairs. Now, John Watson, very curious character, you ever have a chance to take the history of psychology, John Watson's history is a pretty, they really, really should make a mini series out of that. Quite controversial, lots of drama, all of that thing. But John Watson essentially, here we have this very scientific statement of a law coming into the field of psychology, and John Watson uses his influence to define the boundaries of this new world that we're calling behaviorism. He rejected any notion of trying to understand what was going on in a person's consciousness. Now, to understand, historically speaking, a lot of psychology was centered on Freudian theory, looking at the interaction between id, ego, superego, underlying motivations, conflicts within those energies and whatnot. John Watson rejected all of that because you could not directly observe the id, ego, and superego and its exchanges of energy. So John Watson felt that the brain can really be represented as a black box. And what's happening inside the black box, for the most part, is irrelevant. What we can understand is all the things happening around the black box. And if we can find laws, rules, policies, theories, and whatnot that predictably describe the relationships between the black box and, things that happen before and things that happen after and assumptions that are going on in culture and all this stuff, then we don't need to know what's going on inside the mind. Now, his perspective was not anti-science. It was actually very pro-science, and the discipline that he introduced was, let's not talk about anything that we can't directly observe and describe. Let's just not talk about it. Maybe someday, and certainly we have started to do that with brain imaging and whatnot, we can start to see what's happening inside of the black box. But as far as he was concerned, until we find a way to look in that black box, we should be spending our energy trying to understand everything around that black box. This attracted a lot of followers. This made sense to scientists. I just want to study what I can see. I don't want to sit back, light up a cigar, and try and figure out what's going on inside of this black box. It's just too unreliable. I can't really apply the scientific method. So this was quite a push into making psychology much more scientific. Almost going back to its roots in Europe about, the very much the mechanical aspects of understanding psychology. So one of those individuals that came along is B.F. Skinner. Now, B.F. Skinner is responsible for taking this law of effect and looking at the antecedents and consequences of the behavior, basically looking at the factors that surround the black box, the decision making of the animal or human being to do something irrelevant. He was going to manipulate the antecedents, the entire environment, expectations, signals, and whatnot to bring about particular behavior. And he studied those, what we're going to refer to as the A's and the C's, to the point that he had developed a theory of deep understanding of the kinds of antecedents and the kinds of consequences and the sequence of training that could happen to take this being and have it complete extremely complex behaviors. So I'll just give you an example for clarity. So Skinner worked a lot with pigeons. They're readily available in the Harvard area, and he used pigeons as his test animals. And he taught pigeons to play melodies on a piano. That level of complexity. In fact, there's a great story about during World War II, a lot of the universities were called upon to develop anything that they could to help in the war effort. Now, at this time, we had no such thing as guided missiles, so bombs were pretty much blunt instruments. We just carpet bombed everything. Hopefully, we got the target. Just lots of destruction without, and sometimes there were stories of people missing they got the wrong town, they dropped the bombs on a cow field, all those kind of things, both as a money saving and also to put forth a more winning strategy in the war. The government sent out this mandate to different colleges. Now, imagine this. Imagine that I'm a soldier and I'm on the ground and we have a target there's a house that we want obliterated. And I take a special laser and I aim it at that house. Nobody can see that light. And I just aim it at the house and the beam of light hits that house. Now then I have oh, look, I got a little thumbs up on that. Then I have a missile that has a camera on it, and that camera can see that light and can project that on a screen. Now let's train a pigeon to peck on that little spot that's the light on the screen. Okay, so when the pigeon starts to peck over where the light is, the guidance system moves the missile so that the image moves to the middle, and the feedback it's getting is the pigeon inside the missile pecking on the glass or pecking on the screen until it's right in the middle. And the last thoughts of that pigeon are it's pecking right in the middle. And the pigeon has basically steered the missile to hit the designated target. Now, thankfully for pigeons around the world, the war ended with an extremely blunt instrument as we bombed 2 cities in Japan with a nuclear weapon. Hugely blunt instrument, wiping out large areas. So there was no need for Skinner's effort, but through that process, he developed an amazing technology related to, not technology like machines, technology like knowledge, and a incredible ability to change and manage the behavior of animals. Different schedules of reinforcement that are now being used in your paycheck. That's why you can get paid every other week. Different schedules of reinforcement that are used now in gambling, slot machines, about how often certain kinds of winning should happen in order to maximize the behavior of the individual, the environment of the casino. There's no windows, there's no clocks anywhere, so that people can lose their sense of time. All the bright lights made to keep you awake, all of those things, the stimulus coming from you, activating in our brain to keep us awake, just enough winning to keep you going. All of these are the products of the kind of work that Skinner was doing. Now, but what he introduced, and we will get a little bit into this later in the class, I think, is that this could be used for managing people's behavior. Now, one of the biggest ways in which this got used, the ABC contingency theory, was the creation of managed work and learning environments. So these automated sort of ways in which kids could teach themselves. I remember as a child in my early grades, maybe 2nd grade, 3rd grade, there was a sequential reading assignments, SRA cards. I remember that. I think it was sequenced reading assessment or something like that. And what they were progressively more difficult reading assignments and questions for comprehension, color-coded, and an individual approaching that would pick the card out and they would work through getting more and more complex. Now, the thing would be is just naturally speaking, and this comes from the work of Marie Montessori The Montessori method of allowing children to experience a diversity of skill set in order to accomplish a task, and they will naturally gravitate to things that are just a little bit difficult until they can master them. Then they move on to the next. It's a natural tendency in human beings to move on to the next challenge. Not too far, because then we're overwhelmed. Not too easy, because we're bored, but we'll naturally find that zone called the zone of proximal development by the work of Vygotsky. So you have that zone in which we want to go. Now, the reinforcing component of that is, given a set of time and the SRA cards and compelling stories, there was a reward system of every time you moved up to another. It was all numbered and then color coded. You're working in the blues and you're trying to make it to the reds, and like I finally got into the reds, and all of these ways, programmed learning, hugely impacted by the work of B.F. Skinner. Along with that, what B.F. Skinner gave us was the ABC contingency theory, that understanding antecedents and consequences and manipulating those, we have the tools to be able to influence and change behavior, because antecedents and consequences operate on the behavior. And we have all these tools that he created by teaching pigeons to drive rockets and mice and, all of these things. And he studied punishment as well, and he did all of that. Great course to take, the history of psychology, to look at some of this. Now, therapists, people working with problem kids and whatnot, and literally grandmothers across the world would say, we've been doing this for years. We tell a child, this is what I want you to do, and if you get it done, this is the reward you're going to get. That's basically, but it made this extremely scientific. And this class is going to take you beyond that knowledge that you already have, that you talked about right at the beginning of class. You talked about the times when you were managed, the behavior plans that you were put on. We're going to be talking about those again, getting a little bit more specific now in the discussion, but we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty about how those work, how we can use them when they don't work, what we want to do when they don't work, and the specifics of schedules and, reinforcers and punishments and all that stuff. So that brings us to the discussion. We're going to talk about, essentially, I talk about parenting, but here's what I want you to do. It's very similar, and maybe some of you will use the same ideas from previous discussions. But I want to know, and I want to hear from each one of you, of times where you have encountered a behavior plan. Now, the behavior plan, as it exists in the wild, states the conditions under which the behavior must occur, identifies the behavior accurately, and provides a description of the rewards and/or punishments that are going to follow. So it's a little bit more than the discussion that we had before, where you're looking specifically for times in which you've implemented those as a parent, or they're implemented on you, or maybe a correction, like a correction plan at work. You're starting to mess up at work. Your boss sits down with you and says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you these new instruction manuals. We're going to pair you with this, a senior person in your job, and they're going to work with you to get your productivity up to a certain point. We're going to give you the ability to express that behavior within a certain amount of time. And if you can achieve that goal by the end, then we're going to keep you on. Classic behavior plan existing all over the place. That ABC contingency there all the time. So I want you to look at those experiences and describe, for example, how effective were they? Did they work? Because we're going to look at, later in the class, we're going to look at how we define A's, B's, and C's to help this work better. Because oftentimes we don't define those really well, and little loopholes, and people can, either people can achieve rewards without the behavior, or there's just no possible way, or it's hard to tell when the person has actually achieved their goal, those kinds of things. And some of this even relates to like creating goals for yourself in life. Like when you may have heard a person who writes their goals down actually physically writes them down. I think it's not even typing, physically writing it. In the studies that have been done on that, is like 80 times more likely to achieve those goals than someone who didn't write them down. And that writing down of the goals and the specific and the time frames and what you need to do and all that is basically a self behavior plan. Very similar to the major assignment in this class where you're going to be constructing a behavior plan for yourself. So there is some repetition here from the previous chapters. However, now we're talking about it in using the language of antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So in the discussion, I want you to describe what are the antecedents, what's the behavior, what's the consequence, how well did it work, what could have been different, those kinds of things, and share with each other the kinds of advice that you would give to change those or experiences that you've had with people using similar ideas. Okay, so very similar to that, we go into the assignment. Repetition is a really big part of this class. So in the for the assignment, you're going to give me 3 examples of ABC contingency plans. I want you to identify behaviors that fit this. Don't try and fit this into something that's vague. Find true blue type behaviors that you have. The first slide on the slideshow, this is done in PowerPoint, Keynote, whatever. Either way, use Keynote, that's the Apple version of PowerPoint, or use PowerPoint because of what I'm asking you to do. So I'm going to read my notes here. Create a slideshow with presentation notes. So you have the slide, and then underneath those you can expand a little window and you can write notes. And that's what you would be saying if somebody was looking at that slideshow. Slide 1 is a title page, having all of that. Then you go through 3 descriptions of behaviors using the terms antecedent, behavior, and consequence very clearly. You're going to be using for text on there, you're going to be applying what's called the 5x5 rule. In PowerPoint presentations, in slide presentations, you never should have more than 5 words across or 5 lines down, excluding the title. So 5x5. You're not cramming this with words. That's going to go in the notes. So you're creating a slide that just has the basic elements of what you're trying to describe, and then you're going into depth in the notes section. I want you to use graphics, color, use the templates, insert images that help convey the message of what you're trying to say. Not a lot of text on the slides, like I said, the 5x5 rule, and then what you would say, your lecture notes in the notes section. So that's it for this week. Again, this is repetitive, but it's worth repeating that we've been talking about times at which you've been managed. Now we're talking about behavior plans using the language of ABC, and then you're doing it again in the assignment ABC. I'm driving this home so that ABC is automatic. The antecedents, behavior, and consequences before we move on to deeper learning on that. All right, so have a great week this week. Hopefully the weather changes a little bit. I'm going to be posting this on Memorial Day, so have a great Memorial Day, a day off. Take the time to get some rest, and I will see you online in the discussions. Take care.